Welcome back to The Explainer, everyone. Today we're unpacking a situation that's rapidly evolving, incredibly complex, and just highly volatile all around. We are taking a real deep dive into the sudden reignition of the Middle Eastern conflict. Because just as the world thought a fragile peace was finally taking hold, the situation did a total 180. We've got a ton of ground to cover today, so let's just dive right in and break this all down step by step.
So, right out of the gate, the absolute biggest question we need to address is this. What exactly just broke the Middle East ceasefire? We were looking at a really carefully negotiated pause in the fighting, But on July 12th, that brief window of peace was completely shattered. Out of nowhere, we saw this massive spike in hostilities that immediately pushed the entire region right back to the brink of a much, much wider war.
To really wrap your head around the gravity of this July 12th crisis, you just need to look at one number: 140. That is the sheer, staggering scale of the U.S. military response. In a single massive wave of retaliation, American forces struck approximately 140 Iranian military targets. We're talking missile launchers, drone sites, ammunition depots, command and control facilities, the whole naval infrastructure shebang. This wasn't some minor skirmish. This was literally the biggest U.S. military response since the ceasefire had initially taken hold.
Section 1. The July 12th escalation and the spark in the Strait.
Okay, so to see how this built up, we need to zoom in on the exact spark in the Strait of Hormuz that ignited this massive military response. It actually all started with a civilian merchant vessel. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps targeted a Cyprus-flagged container ship transiting the strait. According to the reports, the vessel suffered really significant engine room damage and caught fire, which actually forced the crew to abandon ship. Tragically, one civilian crew member, an Indian national, was reported missing. Now, Iran claimed the vessel completely ignored approved navigation routes and was just struck by a warning shot. Washington entirely rejected that explanation, viewing it instead as a direct threat to commercial shipping. Within hours of that incident, President Donald Trump ordered U.S. Central Command to launch those massive retaliatory strikes we just talked about.
And in Iran's response to those American strikes, it was immediate and honestly pretty chilling. They flat out declared that the Strait of Hormuz, which is one of the most critical waterways on the planet, would remain closed until further notice. They also issued a stark warning that any further attacks would result in them targeting additional U.S. military facilities across the region.
And the fallout wasn't just diplomatic rhetoric. It was a terrifying physical domino effect across the entire Gulf. Iran actively widened the conflict by launching a wave of missiles and drones toward nations hosting U.S. forces. In the UAE, defense systems were actively engaging incoming threats. Over in Qatar, falling shrapnel from intercepted attacks actually injured 3 people, including a child. In Bahrain, which remember, is the home of the U.S. Navy's 5th Fleet, missile alerts sounded for the 3rd time that week. And both Kuwait and Jordan's militaries had to actively intercept incoming fire. In the blink of an eye, the entire region was forced right under the shield of their air defenses.
Section 2. Origins of the 2026 war. Let's rewind to February. To truly understand why the region is such a powder keg today, we really have to look back at the chaotic pace of this conflict. It all kicked off on February 28th, when U.S. and Israeli airstrikes killed several Iranian officials, most notably Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. This sparked an immediate war, prompting what experts described as the largest U.S. military buildup in the Middle East since the 2003 invasion of Iraq. Now, after weeks of intense fighting, an initial 2-week ceasefire was finally agreed upon on April 8th. This paved the way for intense diplomacy, culminating a few months later on June 17th. But, as we've just seen, between July 8th and July 12th, that interim ceasefire completely collapsed.
That June 17th date I mentioned centers entirely around this specific document, the Islamabad Memorandum. This was supposed to be the diplomatic bridge to formally end the war. It was famously signed by U.S. President Trump at the Palace of Versailles and by Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian in Tehran. At first, it successfully lifted a U.S. naval blockade and halted the exchange of attacks. But crucially, the underlying tensions were never actually resolved, which led us directly into the current July crisis.
Before we move on, I want to anchor this conflict in its sheer financial reality: $113.3 billion. As of mid-June 2026, so even before this whole July escalation, that was the estimated cost of this war to U.S. taxpayers. This isn't just some distant geopolitical chess game. The financial stakes, along with the massive deployment of resources, are absolutely staggering.
Section 3. The Strait of Hormuz dispute, the ultimate choke point.
Zooming in geographically to the core territorial dispute that's actively preventing peace, we hit a fundamental, completely irreconcilable clash of legal realities. The U.S. viewpoint, and that of its allies, is that the strait is an international waterway, period. They argue commercial vessels must have absolutely unrestricted freedom of navigation under international law. But the Iranian viewpoint, they argue that as a coastal state, these are territorial waters. Therefore, Iran believes it has the authority to regulate shipping, requiring vessels to seek prior approval and follow very specific routes. It's a direct, head-on collision of perspectives, which is exactly why every single confrontation at sea risks snowballing into a wider military conflict.
And there's a really profound tragedy here, perfectly highlighted by what's known as the Omani Proposal. Just hours, literally hours, before that Cyprus-flagged vessel was attacked, Omani and Iranian officials were actually meeting in Muscat. Omani proposed a practical compromise, allow vessels to use both the southern lane in Omani waters and the northern lane in Iranian waters without any additional approval requirements. Iranian officials were actually taking this proposal back to Tehran for consultation, but diplomacy just ran out of time, and the spark in the strait ignited before this dual-lane solution could ever see the light of day.
Section 4. A widening regional conflict. Mapping the belligerents.
Because when the strait is contested, the web of actors pulled into the crossfire expands dramatically. To grasp the true scope of the 2026 war, just look at these widening alliances. On one side, you have the United States and Israel, actively supported by allied Arab states who basically joined the fray following Iranian strikes on their own territory, specifically the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and Kuwait. Then on the opposing side, you have Iran leading what's known as the axis of resistance. See, this isn't just a state-on-state war anymore. Iran's non-state allies are heavily involved. Just 2 days after the assassination of Khamenei, Hezbollah in Lebanon officially entered the conflict against Israel. You also have the Houthis in Yemen, plus groups like the Popular Mobilization Forces and the Islamic Resistance in Iraq. It has become an incredibly complex, multi-front war.
Section 5. Global Stakes and Future Outlook. The Economic Shockwaves.
So you might be wondering, why does a territorial dispute over a narrow strip of water halfway around the world matter to everyone, everywhere? Well, because 1/5, roughly 20% of all globally traded oil and natural gas passes right through the Strait of Hormuz, under normal conditions. This isn't just a shipping lane, guys. It is literally an artery for the global economy. When Iran restricts shipping here, or when missiles are flying over these waters, it doesn't just affect the Middle East. It chokes the entire world's energy supply.
And the really crucial point here is that this fallout cascades directly down to the consumer level, to you and me. Because of the conflict over this single waterway, the world has experienced a massive global energy shock, resulting in serious fuel crises. We've seen these massive spikes in global oil prices, which have only retreated slightly from wartime highs. But it goes way beyond just gasoline. Natural gas and fertilizer industries are facing heavy disruptions, and that directly impacts global food supplies. The aviation and tourism sectors have taken major hits, and all of this uncertainty has triggered extreme volatility across global financial markets. This distant conflict has very real, very immediate consequences for wallets worldwide.
Which leaves us with this final, lingering question. Can diplomacy survive the strait? With both sides absolutely refusing to compromise their legal views on the waterway, and given the sheer speed at which violence escalated on July 12th, the world is collectively holding its breath. The U.S. says it remains open to negotiation, but they've warned that further attacks will absolutely invite stronger military action. Meanwhile, Iran is standing firm on its closure of the strait and vowing revenge. It's the central flashpoint that will determine whether a permanent agreement can ever be reached, or if this fragile region is inevitably destined for a much wider, way more devastating war. Thank you so much for joining me on The Explainer today, and definitely keep a close eye on how this story develops.